this course, we'll have 4 main units that we'll cover. In the first, we'll talk about molecular biology. Many of this is review from what we've covered previously. We'll talk about things like mitosis and meiosis this week. We'll also talk about things like the structure of DNA and the structure of RNA. However, we will go into greater detail in many of these topics than we had previously. The second unit will focus on gene regulation. Understanding how genes are regulated is incredibly important. We began talking about this in 111, but we'll go into more detail on this. The third area we'll focus on will be genetics in depth. We will continue on what we learned about with Mendelian genetics, but we're going to go into more detail because there's a lot of different places where there are exceptions to the rule. We will also learn about things like population genetics and evolutionary genetics. In the last unit, we'll talk about bioinformatics and biotechnology. These topics really allow us to put everything together in terms of what we learned and apply it to what is actually being done in research labs today. What are the big areas of research? Where are scientists focusing? Okay, so we'll start off this week talking about a history of genetics. We will also talk about mitosis, we'll talk about meiosis, we'll talk about the structure of DNA, RNA, and so forth. So in terms of genetics, really people understood the fact that you inherited traits from your parents back from ancient times. We would not be able to do things like breed dogs, breed corn. If you look at corn back in the day, it was just a tiny little weed, and now it's just this huge giant food that we eat. And dogs, they were domesticated from wild wolves, and now we have many, many different types of dogs. More recently, and I hesitate to use the word recently, but more recently we have the work of Gregor Mendel, and his work involved working primarily with many different types of pea plants. And what he did was he allowed us to develop many of the basic rules from genetics and things that we've been able to use from that. Charles Darwin was also a central player in terms of genetics. He allowed us to understand how objects or people or animals were evolved from other different ones. Okay? And he had a really important work, The Origin of Species. His work, he was pretty much a contemporary for Gregor Mendel. They were both in the 1800s that they did a lot of their work. Then we move again a little bit more recently, and we'll talk about some of the more recent things as Avery, Mcleod, and Mccarty. They were people that allowed us to determine that DNA was the genetic material. Watson and Crick, again, contemporaries, they were in about the 50s or so when they discovered the structure of DNA. And again, knowing the structure of DNA, knowing that DNA was the genetic material, big advances at the time. We didn't know, was it DNA, was it RNA, what was the genetic material?